You're watching Deprogrammed. This is the New Culture Forum's latest current affairs show, devoted to resisting the forces of ideological conformity, particularly among the young. My name's Harrison Pitt. I'm a senior editor at the European Conservative, and I'm delighted to be joined this week, as ever, by Evan Riggs, who is a freelance journalist, and Andy Ngo, senior editor at the Post Millennial and a New York Times best-selling author. Now, Andy, many of our viewers will be well aware of the riots that are erupting in France this week. What do you think are the most important details about these riots that the mainstream media isn't really telling people?
So I've been following the riots closely, and it's just by coincidence that I happen to be in France just days before the riots broke out on the 27th of June. But I've been going to France for a long time. I have family there who live in the banlieue. And
explain to our viewers what the banlieue is.
Banlieue, it means suburb, particularly of, it just means suburbs. Some people associate connotations with it, but there can be nice banlieues and there can be more rough ones.
Yes.
The race riots that erupted in 2005 were concentrated in the banlieues, and the ongoing race riots are happening now are also in some of the banlieues. My book, Unmasked, the first language it was translated to was in French. When I went to France in 2021 to speak and to promote it, I was asked if France could experience something similar to America that America did in 2020 with the BLM Antifa riots. And at that time, I said yes. You have basically the same underlying variables that caused the George Floyd moment, uprising, insurrections, whatever you want to call it, riots. You have those same, very similar variables here in France, and give it time, there will be some moment, some individual who will be exploited as a cause for violence. And that happened on the 27th of June with the death of a police-involved killing of a 17-year-old French-Algerian youth in Nanterre, which is a banlieue in the Paris area. And it sparked 6 days of violence, riots, mass looting, by far worse than the 2005 race riots. It's starting to tutor out a little bit, but this has come at really significant economic cost to France. With so there's been 3,000 arrests so far. 45,000 police officers were mobilized by the second night. 1,500 damaged or destroyed buildings. And these buildings were destroyed through arson attacks and things like schools, police stations, grocery stores, transport infrastructure, housing, businesses, mass looting. At least 5,000 vehicles have been set on fire. So a lot of the riot videos were posted online by the rioters on Snapchat and Instagram.
Triumphantly, so to speak.
Yes, and you could see that it looked really like a war zone because vehicles were overturned on streets and torched, and the police were having to use essentially military equipment to respond.
So, Andy, you said there's the same underlying factors in France which sparked this off as America and the BLM riots of 2020. What are these factors? It's not the unique sort of American history of racial tension, obviously.
No, that's a narrative that is exploited in the US, but in France it's so primarily the same variable is a grievance within a population of a minority population. So in the US it would be, I guess, Black Americans having a long history of grievance against the United States because of slavery and Jim Crow, the legacies of that, and then post all that, then what they claim are unfair policing in their communities, unfair systemic racism in the criminal justice system. So long list of grievances related to race. In France, it's slightly different but very similar. You have about 10% of the population being Muslim, primarily of North African origin, and most of them are of Algerian background. The history of the brutal war for independence in Algeria against France, that has been a long sort of grounding grievance mythos for French Algerian youth today. There are economic disparities, higher rates of criminality and violent incidents involving this particular demographic means there's more interactions with police. So, you have many parallels to the situation in the U.S. and the shooting death of Nahel, the teenager, which happened during a police stop. So he was unlawfully driving this Mercedes. He's 17. You have to be 18 to have a driver's permit or license in France. He was pulled over by police, and he attempted to flee in the car and was shot dead. The officer involved in that has been arrested and is detained and will be prosecuted. But that incident was caught on video, so it was similar to how the George Floyd's last moments was caught on video and widely shared on social media. And there was already a long grievance against the French society, French state among this population, and now there's an excuse to go on the streets and rage.
Do you think that, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, the French... Nahal. Do you think that he's likely to become a sort of martyr figure, much like George Floyd was, or do you think that is kind of an American tinge to these things, where we tend to create, media stars out of people, even to our own detriment often? Do you think this is likely to occur in France as well?
He was immediately treated as a martyr figure to the left, race agitators, left-wing media, left-wing politicians. I mean, the immediate response actually from politicians, including Macron, was to express condemnation against the police officer, even when the facts weren't.
And there's an investigation underway. You shouldn't be prejudicing a case like that.
But actually, in contrast to the U.S., the politicians very quickly, including Macron, came out to condemn the violence and to express support for law enforcement very, very quickly. In the U.S., as the riots were ongoing for weeks and weeks and then months, support for that rage actually continued among mainstream Democrats and left-wing elected officials at the local level.
I mean, you had people like the Vice President Kamala Harris actually, sponsoring bail funds for people who'd been arrested for precisely this kind of violence. I think it was in where was that? It was in
Minneapolis.
In Minneapolis, yes, that's right. One thing I've struggled to find when I've been looking for it is any demographic breakdown of the people being arrested. Do we have any information on that front, or is it the sort of thing which mainstream media outlets tend to be hiding from us in a way? I mean, banlieue in the banlieue in France, it is associated with sort of ghettoization and an extremely high ethnic minority presence, and so you will find BBC articles where they do point out that these riots are concentrated in these areas, but they'll say that they'll use sort of depersonalized language like riots have hit the banlieue, as though it's some kind of impersonal, climactic,
inflicted upon them,
climactic weather event, rather than coming from them. I mean, do we have any ethnic breakdown of the people being arrested here? So we have more information on the extent to which this can really be described as a sore of multiculturalism and multiracialism.
So, according to French law, the French government does not release, and as far as I know, they don't keep racial demographic information of like criminal suspects, convicts, etc. That is in stark contrast to the United States. However, they do release information such as age, and the average age of the riot suspect over the week of rioting has been 17. So this is really being driven by youth. And in my own descriptions of the riots, I call them race riots. I think that's fair.
Yes.
Because you look at the videos, you see it's of a particular majority demographic of the rioters are of some type of African heritage, and so North African or African heritage, and their grievance, according to what they say, is racialized. So I think it's fair to describe them as race riots. With that said, that doesn't mean there aren't white people involved in the riots. There are some.
Because this was very much the case in the United States during the BLM riots. I mean, there wasn't any obvious, overwhelming black representation necessarily in those riots. I'm sure there were some black people involved in those BLM Antifa riots, but there were, in places like Portland, where you've done a lot of coverage, obviously, you're well renowned for it. A lot of the people who are getting arrested are, in fact, white ne'er-do-gooders, aren't they? Whereas in France, you get the sense that
the difference is in France, the number of the leftist white rioters, at least from what I saw from the videos and photos, they did seem to be rather smaller compared to the U.S. 2020 riots. There are groups who describe themselves as anti-fascists, like Marseille Antifa, and others who put out calls for direct actions for their members and sympathizers to come out and to join this moment of revenge against the state. However, it was, in my view, it's like they weren't needed as agitators for violence. The protests were going to be riotous regardless, because the youths not linked to Antifa were already immediately organizing through Snapchat about where to meet up, where to go, which areas to gather in. So, Antifa tried their best to exploit, but they're just really kind of one small element, because, you do have such a large, I guess that's 10% of France is Muslim, and within that you have a large pool to pull from of young people who have hatred of the state, of French society, of French culture, and the riots are, the people who are supporting it are, it is kind of a wide coalition of people from the left, but there are also like Islamists and Muslim extremists as well who have shown up, and the things they are saying on camera, anti-Semitic things. There was a large memorial to the victims of the Holocaust in Nanterre, which is the same banlieue where the shooting of the teen happened. I mean, that was vandalized by the protesters. And that's actually, even caused representative from Israel to condemn that and call for France to clamp down on anti-Semitic attacks.
So it's not Antifa spurring this on. It's not violent video games, as Emmanuel Macron said. Do you think? What do you make of the reaction to the right, or of the right? Eric Zemmour has come out. Marine Le Pen has come out. The police union from France came out and I think called them like savage hordes, was the direct translation. What do you think is going to be the future of the French right in the aftermath of these riots?
No one really has good predictions on where France will go politically after Macron's second term is over. He won't be able to run again in his 2-term limit. It was under him that the traditional left and right parties that were the primary choices for voters for a very long time, it's collapsed. The Republican,
and the Socialists.
It's the center-right. That party's collapsed, and the Socialists on the left has also collapsed. So regarding Eric Zemmour, the statements that he has now about the riots, which is essentially that this is a form of civil war, it's a theme in many of his commentary in his books for a very long time. In fact, that was a very central part of his presidential campaign last year, when he talked about how there's this segment of French society that hates its country and is willing to go to war with what it means to be French in the state itself.
He's one of the more. I think the hope in. So you're right. It was last year, wasn't it? In 2021, that he ran hoping to steal some of Marine Le Pen's thunder, so to speak. And there was a hope that he might be the more palatable intellectual restrictionist, and also the fact that he has Jewish heritage as well. There was a hope that, given the fact that Marine Le Pen's father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, had I think publicly denied the Holocaust in the early 2000s. Even though lots of Jews in France are understandably anxious about the increasing Islamization of their country, as well they might be, Marine Le Pen struggled to appeal to them and to appeal to educated members of the French intelligentsia who perhaps read Michel Houellebecq's books, in a way that there was a hope that Eric Zemmour could do that. But then I think he stumbled over some of the comments he'd made over Russia-Ukraine, didn't he? Which he made some very flattering comments about Putin, which all of a sudden meant he was irredeemable in the aftermath of the invasion of Ukraine. And so I wonder whether he'll run again. But there's no doubt that Marine Le Pen is definitely, and her sort of rebranded Rassemblement National outfit is certainly going to. I mean, they've been edging closer in that second round. They've been edging closer each time, and I think it's only a matter of time before she does seriously challenge. Well, it won't be Macron or whoever fills the void left by Macron's absence.
Yeah, she's not going anywhere.
She's not going anywhere.
Do you think that these riots are likely to influence the politics of kind of some surrounding Schengen nations? I mean, Spain is about to have another general election in 3 weeks, and I think it would be pretty foolish to think that the Spanish right isn't going to just point to Paris and say, "Look at this. We'll make sure this never happens here." They're already on an upswing. I think it's kind of a bird in the hand for them, essentially.
I don't know. I mean, there were years of very frequent mass deadly attacks by jihadists who exploited migrant streams into Europe and across different countries, and that it didn't really bring about this huge right-wing populist backlash as many people are anticipating. I mean, there were some parties that did a bit better. AfD in Germany capitalized off.
They're doing better than ever.
Yeah, but it's not like they have been able to go into government or anything. Sweden, I mean, yes, years later now you have Sweden Democrats in a coalition government, but it wasn't like immediately that voters are reacting to deadly violence you see around them connected to migration. But on this, I mean, the riots in France did spread to at least 2 other countries, to a much smaller scale, but it's noteworthy. I mean, in Brussels, parts of Belgium also have North African communities with very similar grievances, and this was particularly exposed with some of the Paris attacks, the Brussels attacks, how these were cells that were in communication with each other in cross paths. And
the people who committed the Paris attacks in 2015, they were chased down to Molenbeek in Brussels, weren't they? Or some of them were, at least. I seem to recall.
The one that survived, he didn't use a suicide vest. He fled back to the community he's from, Molenbeek.
Yes.
It's a neighborhood in Brussels that is very heavily Muslim.
Yes.
And there was a big manhunt for him because he was that one person that everyone's all the authorities were looking for, and he just went back to where he grew up.
Yes,
and it took weeks to find him.
But the fact that the fact that these incredibly poorly assimilated, ghettoized minorities act as, so to speak, dry tinder for this wildfire of race-based grievance politics, it underscores one of the core problems with multiculturalism, which is that multiculturalism only, well, I don't know, diversity, so to speak, diversity on a grand scale of that kind, it only really works if the ideal of colorblindness makes a claim on everyone, and everyone is equally signed up to the Martin Luther King ideal of we care about the content of individuals' characters, we don't care about our own ethnic tribal divisions. One of the things that this reveals, and the fact that it's spread from France to Belgium where this didn't even happen, is that there are asymmetric rates of ethnocentrism between the ancestral population of France and these poorly assimilated communities. And there's to give one point of contact with how this manifests itself. Only 4 weeks ago in France, a Syrian asylum seeker went around a local park stabbing children and mothers.
Yeah.
And the response of the French ancestral population, obviously that was disapproved of, but the disapproval was moral in a general sense. It wasn't necessarily conceived of by the French as an attack on us as French people, which is why it doesn't trigger the same kind of ethnically fueled reaction in France. So instead of having these kinds of race riots, the French people, by and large, just had fairly peaceful vigils. And this is when children are being stabbed. Yet when it's a young man who, as I understand, was actually fairly serial petty criminal, as I understand. Is that true?
He was known to police.
He was known to police.
Yeah.
He's clearly been involved in these sorts of things. And now, maybe the officer was unjustified. We don't need to get into that. But the fact that, which is clearly less morally outrageous than the murder of stabbing a kid who's done, clearly less morally ambiguous than that. The fact that the children of your own country being fatally not fatally stabbed but being maimed in that way triggers less of a French reaction than the killing of a minority do-gooder does for people in Belgium. It goes to show that when you have these asymmetric rates of ethnocentrism, you're going to get extremely morally demented results in terms of how people react to given events and given actions, and that clearly isn't sustainable in places like France, in places like Belgium, and indeed places like Britain, where we also have this ghettoization problem because our politicians have been sleeping at the wheel on this and thinking that being British or being French or being Belgian is just a matter of having a passport and being, on paper, a French citizen, rather than someone who is truly integrated into the country, truly signed up to its norms, feels an emotional connection to its heritage, and all these sorts of things. And I just wonder what we can do in European countries to address that problem. I mean, I'm joined by two immigrants here. I mean,
guilty as charged.
Guilty. So I don't want to rage for too long. But I mean, what do you think that people in Britain, people in France, people in Belgian, politicians in Belgium, these kinds of places can do to address these what seem like intractable problems?
Well, you do point out that there's this asymmetric
ethnocentrism.
Yeah, and it's well, I mean, if there's some type of perceived injustice against, let's say, someone of a Muslim background in France, I mean, it can ignite massive riots, and indiscriminate violence and destruction and arson attacks. When let's say Jewish elderly people are killed, as has happened in France by a Muslim assailant, nobody riots. After the Paris attacks, how the French society responded was let's come together and hold these candlelight vigils. So it's I'm not arguing for one side, for the one side to match the aggression of the other. What I'm arguing is that you have this type of disparity. And nothing is done to really. It seems like nothing is really done to counter this type of violence, grievance, way of thinking that's in the mind of some of these communities.
Yes.
Why does it seem that there's never a don't look back and hate sort of movement or moment in response to this from people of the community, and also from the left, even from the right, from anywhere. It just doesn't seem to come up at all. It's only when somebody blows up a bomb in Manchester that this kind of rhetoric comes out. Whereas then, if you have a man stabbing kids in strollers, I've seen, who's the guy from, it was like the university here in England, where he's like, well, we need to understand that these people have been like poorly assimilated.
Yes.
And we can't say this is a terror attack.
He was a professor, I can't remember his name, but he was a professor at LSE, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, just, I simply can't understand the mentality of wanting to go on TV and saying that. I mean, even if you thought it, just saying it publicly is bizarre. But it seems that there's always a bit of a, not only a discrepancy in the ethno-narcissism, but a discrepancy in how everybody reacts to these across the board politically. Maybe that could be a potential solution. I mean, obviously we don't want to raise ethno-narcissism among the host populations.
Exactly,
that would go pretty abysmally, to say the least. But maybe it should then be, the case for our politicians and for the community leaders to kind of foster this response. And two, I mean, there's pretty harsh hate crime and free speech restrictions, hate crime laws and free speech restrictions on the continent and in this country. And it seems that if people are going on Snapchat or on TikTok or name your social media platform and bringing these, kind of pushing these riots on people, there should be some accountability there. I mean, I don't know what other potential solution there could possibly be.
Yes.
What do you think, Andy? Do you think that would be stepping too far, or do you think that's basically the only way to kind of preserve the peace?
Well, I don't know what potential solutions are, but I think one thing that has to happen is more open discussions about these issues. And it, as has been for a number of years, intellectuals or writers or academics who raise issues that come out of certain minority populations within the state, that is seen as an idea that cannot be discussed or debated in mainstream society. I mean, for us here, we're beyond that. We're talking about this openly. I was just thinking, last year there was a similar incident, I guess, where the backgrounds of the victim and the assailant were reversed. There was a 14-year-old girl in France who was white, whose dismembered remains were found in a
suitcase, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the suspected assailant, who's apprehended, is someone of North African background, is an immigrant. I forget from which country. It might have been somewhere in North Africa. But that was just in how it was reported was and framed as it's a crime and murder story. And that may be the case. I'm not saying that every incident where the race of the victim and assailant are different is there's a racial angle.
Indeed,
but
yes.
It's just, I mean, it is the norm that there's not, there's not really any rage in wider society when I guess they're are victimized from within.
It's a bit of a bleak picture. I mean, I think even the French government official, I think he ran one of those balloons, is it?
Yeah.
They set a car on fire and
yes.
drove it into his house.
Yes.
They broke his wife's leg. They hospitalized one of his children. He tweeted about it, and then I believe that the tweet has been taken down. I believe he went too far, basically saying, like, I'm not going to give up on France and the Republic. And
Well, you don't want to inflame tension, do you, at this point?
well, we don't want to look back and hate.
So that happened in Les Laurels, which is another banlieue of Paris. And this is actually, it was the mayor, his family home. And this happened on the 5th night of the race riots. And this was quite shocking even for France. France has lots of politically inspired riots. But this one, because it was targeting the family home of a politician, a fire a car that was set on fire rammed into his home. It's being investigated as an attempted murder because the children and the wife were asleep there at the time. The mayor was working in the town hall, I believe, so he wasn't home to protect his family. And the wife, and when the wife and the children were fleeing, they were shot at with these projectile fireworks, which have been excessively used by the rioters to disorient police, injure police, burn people, and also to try, to act as sort of like to stop fires as well.
I think it's one of the regrets of multiculturalism and diversity in a way that it in order to address some of the less desirable consequences of that dogma, that ideology, the state does need to expand into areas of life where once it would have trusted the more homogenous population to keep itself to itself. And I do think it is necessary in places like Britain, in places like France, in places like Belgium, for governments to sponsor quite proactive and not aggressive necessarily, but certainly very proactive and unambiguous assimilation programs. Because to give you, we cannot have a situation in European democracies where the demographic balance of the population is such that tensions and fractious rioting and all that sort of thing can be inflamed at any given moment, because these things are, so to speak, primed for that. And it doesn't even necessarily need to be racial. I mean, the United States grapple with some of this, and not to do with their black population, grapple with some of this at the turn of the 20th century, where you had not necessarily ghettoized, but very clearly geographically demarcated German American communities and Irish American communities. And so when Woodrow Wilson wanted to take America into the First World War, for example, in 1916-17, he was very nervous because he thought that Irish immigrant populations wouldn't want to fight with the British, and German Americans wouldn't want the Americans fighting against their own cousins overseas. So these sorts of things can happen, but over time, when as long as you stem the flow and you encourage integration and melding and intermarriage rates. Now we're at a time where it's perfectly conceivable that someone might have German ancestry in the United States, yet they're not, and that might be a curiosity to them, but it doesn't mean that they're going to see every single political issue in the United States through the lens of their non-negotiable German identity. And we need to engineer a situation where that is as true in Britain of people who have some Bangladeshi ancestry, or people who have some Pakistani ancestry, or North African ancestry in France, in Belgium, that sort of thing. I mean, it's a long project, and it's one that I don't want to have to embark upon, but it doesn't seem that we have a choice.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this many times. I don't know, I think that can work for America, even though it's difficult, but I'm much less optimistic about that working in European countries. I think just the culture for it isn't there. It wasn't kind of founded on the mythos. It's too old. It's just too old here. Like, France has been around forever. It would be nice. I think that would probably be the most peaceful solution.
Yes.
We should also probably not forget that the Americans literally put the Japanese in camps
True.
during the Second World War.
Yes, of course.
To kind of circumvent this problem. Though I think Japanese Americans would not be likely to rise up against America now. So.
True.
That's 70 years. And so, I mean, if we really kind of fast forward 70 years ahead for places like Paris, I mean, I don't know if Paris is 70 years to kind of peacefully integrate.
It's an absolute mess, and there's no obvious ready-made solution that suggests itself. Certainly, I mean, Rafe Heidelmanku, one of our colleagues at the NCF, has a very good chapter in our book Fighting Back, where he talks about some of the proactive, more heavy-handed than might have been expected 40 years ago policies that are being tried in Denmark in order to fight against ghettoization. Because so long as you have ghettoization in these sorts of communities, integrating people becomes to that extent much more intractable, because the natural pressures that would be exerted upon people to integrate when they're very self-conscious of themselves as a minority in a foreign land, that's not going to be anywhere near as strong when you're in a part of Birmingham which might as well resemble Morocco or Pakistan. You're too enmeshed in your tribal ethnic community in order to feel any necessary loyalty towards Britain. And in the case of France, there all these videos doing the rounds where people who live in these banlieues being asked questions like, "Do you feel French?" and they're pretty openly saying that no, they don't. They identify more with their own ancestral heritage, and part of that's perfectly natural. It's because it's all they know, because it's all they're surrounded by.
Yeah, I think we should. I brought this up before too, but we should never forget the fact that there are people living in these areas too that genuinely do not have any sort of resentment to the places that they're living in, and really do just kind of want to integrate to the best of their ability without losing their culture and their heritage, but be actual productive members of society. I mean, I'm a lifelong immigrant, so I can attest to this mentality.
Is there a Canadian diaspora in London?
Very easily. I haven't met them yet.
Exactly.
But if any one of them gets killed, I'm going to be out on the streets. But I think too, we should never forget about these people who really are trying to, who want to be as integrated into France as they possibly can be, and who are being kind of terrorized in their own homes and then subjugated into this sort of collectivist mentality with these rioters and criminals, kind of against their will, and it's what is being allowed to happen is unfair to France. It's unfair to the French. It's unfair to immigrants who are actually trying to assimilate, because that makes it just so much harder for them to do so. And their neighborhoods are literally being torn apart. So I don't know, as much as we should talk about the host populations, I always do have a little bit of empathy left for these people who really are being put in an impossible situation of their own that I think is often overlooked. And I think maybe a good solution, a peaceful solution to these problems would be to identify the community leaders in these groups and try to empower them, and perhaps by using platforms like this, or using government interventions of some way to make this case known and to make them feel kind of protected and promoted from within their own communities. Maybe I genuinely can't think of another more peaceful, pragmatic solution than that.
And it's true as well, isn't it? That most in the BLM Antifa riots in 2020, the primary victims of those riots were people who live, as Evan says, in the case of France, in America too, people who lived in minority neighborhoods. I mean, that's where most of the property damage was, like $2 billion's worth or something like that, maybe 1.2 billion worth of property damage done in the 2020 BLM Antifa riots. Those people are the primary victims. Do you think that there's do you agree with Evan that there's room to try and reach out an olive branch, so to speak, to those people and elevate them while deporting all of the troublemakers?
I mean, it feels like it's almost like too late now for governments to work with the better community representatives, whatever you want to call them. For so long, the mistake was, and this was just out of ignorance of the host population, is that they didn't know that some of these community representatives who were elevated and empowered were Islamists who very strongly have an agenda of inculcating a separatist mentality in the communities that they purport to represent.
Yes.
So in Britain, this is particularly an acute issue with all these organizations, Islamic organizations, Muslim organizations that the government worked with and treated as legitimate voices of Muslims, and they were within their own mosques, or their preachers that were associated with these organizations were preaching really extremist beliefs.
And these are people as well who had, in many cases, not only who had an ideological interest in what you call separatism, quite rightly, but also a vested financial interest in separatism, because their aplomb and their status and their standing as community representatives would be diminished if the Muslim population of Britain were, so to speak, to become more integrated into the surrounding population, so as to become less distinguishable from the host population. All of a sudden, they would lack that, that status and that, that street cred in the community. If integration is successful, so it's almost as though they have a vested interest financially as well as ideologically in, maintaining a certain kind of frosty separatism between communities. But sorry, go on. What were you going to continue saying before I interrupted so rudely?
Well, in France, I think the French philosophy for what it means to be a French citizen is race neutral, intentionally, and the state has for a long time taken a very strong hand in particularly religious assimilation towards laïcité, which is their version of secularism, where the state is actually above the church or the house of worship. And I mean, to the point of where the French state will actually remove symbols that have been part of its own history and heritage in order to enforce a sort of ultra neutral a-religious space in public spaces. And that's been a huge point of grievance for the Islamists in France. They were really radical. A lot of them were really radicalized over the banning of religious symbols in state schools up to essentially high school. The hijab issue. I mean, that was a big thing that was cited a lot by the jihadists. But it doesn't really matter if you come out. It seems like in the end, and then you can have, so on one end you have France, for example, let's say banning open expressions of religiosity in public spaces like schools, courthouses, etc. And then you have the other hand, Britain or America, where it's completely embraced as respecting religious freedom and individual choice and rights, but then both are still targeted with jihadist attacks. So it almost seems like the policies can be really radically different in how they choose to integrate, and
the same problems,
very limited effect.
The same problems result. And thank you very much for joining us on Deprogrammed this week. Evan, thanks as ever. You've been watching Deprogrammed. We hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe and make a comment, and we shall see you on the next one.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.